Okay, so we're diving into St. Francis de Sales today. His feast day is coming up on January 24th. And he's got this reputation as, the gentleman saint.
Right, right.
Which always makes me think, like, how gentlemanly can a saint be? But then you realize he's also a doctor of the church, patron of writers and journalists. So clearly there's more to him than just fancy manners. And that's what we're going to explore today, using this biography by Father Wilson.
Exactly. And what's so fascinating about Father Wilson's take is that he doesn't shy away from the fact that Francis wasn't, born a saint.
Yeah, like, we always picture these guys, halos from day one.
Yeah.
But Father Wilson really dives into Francis's struggles, like his real human anxieties and fears.
It's refreshing, right? It makes him way more relatable. Like, did you know he used to be terrified of the dark as a kid?
No, I did not know that.
Yeah.
Okay, so even saints can have, like, totally normal childhood fears.
Exactly. It just makes you realize they're not these untouchable figures. They're people who struggled and grew and ultimately found holiness. And then there's that whole period in Paris when he's battling with the idea of predestination.
Oh, yeah, like the whole fate is already decided thing. Imagine trying to wrap your head around that in your 20s.
Talk about pressure. And Father Wilson really captures how intensely Francis wrestled with this. I mean, we're talking full-on spiritual crisis, almost a breakdown. But then picture this. He's in a random church in Paris feeling completely lost, and he makes this desperate prayer to Mary.
Okay, this sounds intense.
He basically surrenders completely to God's will, even if it means eternal damnation. And it's in that act of surrender, that letting go of control, that he finds this incredible peace.
Wow. Talk about a leap of faith.
Right, and that moment becomes the foundation of his entire approach to spirituality.
It's amazing how something so dark can become such a turning point.
And we have to remember, this is all happening against the backdrop of the Reformation. Paris in the 1500s was a hotbed of religious debate.
Oh, yeah. Not exactly a relaxing environment to be having a faith crisis.
Exactly. It adds this whole other layer of complexity to his story. But let's rewind a bit, go back to his beginnings. Francis was actually born into a noble family, His dad had big plans for him. Law, politics, the whole 9 yards.
Ah, so a classic following in your father's footsteps kind of story.
Kind of, but not quite. Even as a child, there were hints he might be drawn to something different.
Father Wilson mentions that his first words were something like, "God and my mother love me much."
Ah, that's so sweet.
Yeah. I mean, adorable, sure, but also maybe a sign of things to come.
Right, but it wasn't all, piety and prayers. He was a real kid, got into mischief, had his fears.
Okay, good, because nobody wants to hear about a perfect child saint. That's just creepy.
Exactly. He was human, and Father Wilson does a great job of showing that. But as Francis grew up, his education became kind of a tug of war between his father's plans and his own internal compass.
So you've got Dad pushing for the secular path, sending him to the best schools, and Francis keeps gravitating back towards religion.
Yep. Classic inner conflict. And eventually it leads him to study with the Jesuits.
Ah, the Jesuits. Known for their, shall we say, rigorous approach to learning.
Exactly. And they were right at the forefront of engaging with the intellectual debates of the Reformation.
So basically he's got this noble upbringing, he's wrestling with huge questions of faith, and now he's diving deep into some of the most challenging theological ideas of the time. That's a lot for a young guy.
It is, and this is just the beginning. Remember that whole papal appointment we mentioned, the Provost of Geneva thing?
Yeah, like a high-ranking church position in a super Calvinist area. That sounds fun.
Well, fun might not be the word for it. That's where things really start to get interesting. But we'll have to save that for part 2.
All right, so last time we left off with Francis, law degree in hand, facing this papal appointment as Provost of the Geneva chapter. And it's not just any appointment, right? This is Geneva, the heart of Calvinism. It's like they're sending him into the lion's den.
It really was. And you have to remember, this is the Reformation era. The Catholic Church is struggling to regain a foothold, and Francis is thrust right into the center of this religious battleground.
Talk about pressure. And we know he wasn't exactly, a stranger to doubt himself.
Precisely. And Father Wilson really highlights that. Before even stepping foot in the Chablais region, Francis spends weeks in prayer and fasting. He knows this isn't going to be a walk in the park.
And from what we've read, the Chablais was basically a spiritual wasteland for Catholics at the time. Churches destroyed, priests driven out. It sounds pretty bleak.
It was a tough situation, no doubt. And remember, he's not going in alone. His cousin, Louis de Sales, goes with him. And Father Wilson describes how they faced real danger. Threats, insults, even attempts on their lives. It was a risky mission.
Wow, so they were literally putting their lives on the line to bring people back to Catholicism.
They were. And what's remarkable is that Francis never wavered in his commitment to peace and gentleness. He didn't fight fire with fire. He understood that true conversion comes from the heart, not from coercion.
So how does he even begin to approach this? I mean, it's one thing to have a theological debate. It's another to actually change people's hearts and minds, especially when they're facing such hostility.
That's where the gentleman saint aspect really shines through. Father Wilson emphasizes how Francis engaged in respectful dialogue with Calvinist leaders. He sought common ground, highlighted the beauty and truth of Catholicism, but in a way that resonated with people, not just lecturing at them.
I guess you could say he was a master of persuasion. And didn't he get banned from preaching publicly at some point?
He did, but that didn't stop him. Father Wilson talks about how he started writing these little pamphlets, almost like mini essays on faith, and slipping them under people's doors at night.
Huh. Like some kind of 16th century leaflet drop. Talk about creative evangelism.
Right. He understood the power of the written word, which is probably why he's now the patron saint of writers and journalists. He found a way to get his message out, even when faced with opposition.
And it worked, right? People started coming back to the church.
It was a gradual process, but yes. Father Wilson mentions the conversion of Pierre Poncet, a prominent Calvinist lawyer who'd been a staunch opponent of Catholicism. His conversion was a turning point, a real testament to Francis's approach.
It's amazing how one person's dedication can have such a ripple effect. But while all this is happening, he's also dealing with, normal life stuff. Father Wilson mentions him arranging his sister's marriage around this time.
Exactly. He wasn't just this, otherworldly figure. He was grounded in the realities of family community. It makes him even more human, know. And then amidst all this, he has this incredible mystical experience.
Oh, yeah. Father Wilson describes it as a vision that really solidified his sense of purpose and gave him this deep inner peace.
It's like all these pieces are starting to fall into place. He's facing challenges head on, he's seeing the fruits of his labor, and he's deepening his own spiritual connection.
Sounds like he's really hitting his stride. But remember that whole coadjutor bishop thing? That's still looming, right?
Oh, absolutely. It's about to shake things up again. His work in the Chablais hasn't gone unnoticed, and that promotion comes with a whole new set of responsibilities and challenges. But we'll have to dive into that in part 3.
All right, so we left off with Francis about to become the coadjutor bishop. And this is a big deal, right? It's not just a promotion. It's a chance to really shape the spiritual landscape.
It is. And what I find so interesting is how Father Wilson points out that even as he's taking on this huge responsibility, Francis never abandons his work in the Chablais. He doesn't just forget about the people he's connected with.
He's not one to just climb a ladder and leave everyone behind. It shows a real commitment to those personal connections.
And it's around this time that he meets Jane de Chantal. That becomes a pivotal relationship.
Ah, yes, Jane de Chantal. I was wondering when she'd enter the picture. This is the woman who, alongside Francis, would go on to found the Visitation Order.
Right. And Father Wilson does a really beautiful job of portraying their connection. It's this deep, genuine friendship rooted in their shared faith. And through their letters, you can really sense that mutual respect and this shared vision they had.
Yeah. They both wanted to create a more accessible, more inclusive form of religious life for women.
Exactly. And Francis saw in Jane someone who could lead this new kind of community, one focused on prayer, service, and genuine sisterhood.
So from challenging Calvinism to founding a new religious order, he's a busy guy. But even with all the success, Father Wilson makes it clear that Francis wasn't immune to setbacks.
Oh, for sure. He had his fair share of disappointments. Like his dream of establishing a seminary in Geneva never materialized. And there were other initiatives that just didn't work out the way he'd hoped.
It's kind of comforting, actually. Like, even saints experience failure.
It makes him human, right? But what's striking is how he dealt with those setbacks. Father Wilson emphasizes how Francis saw them as opportunities for growth, a chance to surrender to God's plan.
So it's not about never failing, but about how you respond to those failures.
Exactly. It's about resilience, about finding meaning even in disappointment. And honestly, that's a pretty powerful lesson for anyone, whether they're deeply religious or not.
It is. Life's full of curveballs.
Yeah.
It's all about how you handle them. Well, we've covered a lot in this deep dive into the life of St. Francis de Sales.
We have. And, as we wrap up, what really strikes me is how relevant his story still feels today. We've got all this division, all this chaos in the world, and Francis's emphasis on gentleness, humility, love. It feels like a much-needed antidote.
Absolutely. And I think that's what makes Father Wilson's biography so compelling. He doesn't just give us a dry account of facts and dates. He shows us a man who, despite his struggles and setbacks, lived out these values in a way that truly changed the world.
And on that note, as we approach this feast day, it's a good reminder that holiness isn't about being perfect. It's about showing up every day, being present in the world, and responding with love and compassion.
Beautifully said. And on that note, we'll leave you with the challenge to embrace a little bit of that gentleman saint spirit in your own lives. Who knows, you might just change the world.